Welcome back to Top 10 Tunes. Today we're going to be looking at the top 10 technical death metal albums of all time. Coming in at number 10 is the most recent pick on this list, Bleed the Future by Archspire. By the release of this album in 2021, modern death metal has been defined by the developments in the gent and deathcore subgenres. Canadians Archspire embraced their idiosyncratic love of tech death, and by the release of Bleed the Future would be considered the leaders of the style. From the opening track, Drone Corpse Aviator, to the title track Bleed the Future, is unrelenting in its virtuosity and notes per square inch approach. Even their vocalist approach is incredibly percussive and manages to keep up with and in many ways encourage the blistering tempos present. Bleed the Future isn't the continuation of a bygone sound, but the festering of death metal evolution. At number 9 is the ambitiously progressive Where Owls Know My Name by Rivers of Nihil. The line between progressive and technical death metal is often debated, but really are two variations of death metal's development: the incorporation of varied sounds and textures, and further emphasis on virtuosity and complex musical passages. On Where Owls Know My Name, they continue the traditional tech death tropes while incorporating both hazy introspective lyrics and, most notably, the saxophone, an instrument completely foreign to death metal and heavy metal as a whole. The saxophone provides an airy texture reminiscent of 1970s prog rock and is also considered one of the hallmark instruments of jazz. This bold musical voice is a unique take on tech death and stands on its own experimental merit. At number 8 is None So Vile by Cryptopsy. One of the dominant bands from the Montreal tech death scene, Cryptopsy cemented their sound and legacy on this album. None So Vile manages to balance both elements from technical and brutal death metal. While brutal death metal can include virtuosic instrumental passages in of itself, the drum guitar interplay of None So Vile owes more to the tech death progressive mindset and is a sound that has been often mimicked ever since. What hasn't been interpreted in quite the same way, however, are the vocals of Lord Worm. The combination of his speed and enunciation with the wide tonal variety of guttural sounds impacts the larger mood of the soundscape of an otherwise unrelenting death metal album. None So Vile represented two separate routes modern death metal bands could take in their extremity, but all presenting technicality at its most raw. Coming in at number 7 is the oft-neglected but primordial record, The Key by Nocturnus. In many ways, The Key can be considered the first progressive death metal album, and by creating the concept album in 1990, Nocturnus were far ahead of the curve. While still maintaining a sacrilegious and previously anti-Christian theme that continued the material present in early death metal, Nocturnus elaborated further through the inclusion of keyboards and a more sci-fi based narrative. While the musicianship and tone of Nocturnus were still in line with traditional death metal, the scope of The Key by Nocturnus foreshadowed what was to come, and that death metal as a whole has limitless possibilities. Our number 6 pick is the experimental Focus by Cynic. By the release of Focus, founding Cynic members had already made their name in the realm of death metal and had already begun to pioneer the sound of tech death, appearing on the death album Human. While Focus has since been name-checked more often by progressive metal lists, and the vocoder-laced vocals and fretless electric bass owe to the musical avant-garde, Focus is a record that revels in death metal technicality, and the pedigree of its members both elevated and challenged the creativity of their peers. At number 5 is the transitional Testimony of the Ancients by Pestilence. While transitioning from thrash metal to traditional death metal on their second album, Consuming Impulse, it was their third album, Testimony of the Ancients, that opened into a realm of technical death metal. With Patrick Mameli filling the vocal role along with guitar came greater songwriting and compositional influence. The influence as well of contemporary bands Atheist and Death encouraged the genre of death metal to move forward. On the consequent Pestilence albums, the band would move further into jazz fusion territory, but Testimony of the Ancients was a glimpse of Pestilence helping to create death metal's enduring modern identity. At number 4 is the endearingly challenging Obscura by Goreguts. The technical death metal scene of Montreal, Quebec has produced many endearing bands, and the scene itself has fostered a consistency of technical bands in the death metal scene. However, Goreguts were one of the earliest bands in the scene and were even seen as the Canadian answer to Death's prolific influence and output. While Goreguts have a discography ironclad in adventurousness, Obscura stands out as being the most challenging and a rite of passage for any wishing to immerse themselves in the wonderfully weird. The record is rife with the avant-garde, and the feeling of French-Canadian obscurity and artistic expression can be felt, while Goreguts have distanced themselves from the label of technical death metal as they chase a different muse each album. They are liberal with their choices in sound and arrangement. They can't be understated in reference to the experimental death metal scene. At number 3 is the eager statement of musicianship, Unquestionable Presence by Atheist. Their first album, Piece of Time, pushed the boundaries of traditional death metal and aggressive thrash metal, but still remained an immature lyrical and instrumental statement by musicians eager to make a statement. It also introduced the very talented musicianship of the now late bassist Roger Patterson. Before the release of Unquestionable Presence, Patterson had written and arranged the bass parts, but sadly passed before the album's recording and release. This album and contemporary releases by Cannibal Corpse and Suffocation were dedicated to Roger Patterson and what he brought to the musicianship of technical death metal. Jazz fusion, odd time signatures, and even samba rhythms were fair game. Unquestionable Presence, no stone was left unturned. At number 2 is the singular onset of putrefaction by Necrophagist. The brainchild of multi-instrumentalist Mohamed Suichmez, all vocals, guitar, and bass were performed by him, as well as the programming, the drum parts. For an album of 1999, this predated the advent of ease of operation of home recording. An industry exists nowadays for programming drums, whereas Mohamed would have been meticulous in his vision. The sound of Onset of Putrefaction was in taking burlesque melodies and compositional style and melding them with intense death metal. By coming from a neoclassical mindset and acting as a one-man band, Onset of Putrefaction would inspire hordes of tech death fanatics and bedroom guitarists to envision and create their own death metal bands and push the boundaries of how they heard their music. This album inspired the globalization and ingenuity of modern tech death metal. And number 1, which arguably the record that started it all, is Human by Death. The band that started death metal as a whole often found themselves at the forefront of the genre's various developments and offshoots, and Human was the first of the records to deviate from what would be considered traditional death metal, with the addition of members of the band Cynic Death infused with progressive and jazz fusion elements with Chuck Schuldender's well-established style, this being a common theme across the career of Death, and enhanced Death's image as a band that would regularly implode and be revived by Chuck's vision for death metal. The track Lack of Comprehension even received heavy MTV and airplay rotation, proving to be the mainstream public's introduction to this new wave of death metal. To this day, and despite their reputation as the genre's forefather, Human is their best-selling album and definitive statement of regeneration and evolution.